April 1941. A gray rain fell over Berlin as officers from the Luftwaffe gathered in a dimly lit war room, maps pinned to the walls like trophies of past victories. The mood was confident, even smug. They had swept through Poland, crushed France, and bombed London into submission. The war, they believed, was already won in principle. Now it was only a matter of time. In the center of the table, a thick folder marked U.S. Industrial Capacity sat unopened for hours. No one took it seriously. They called it the Milk Report, a mocking reference to the American habit of placing civilians, even women, into their industrial labor force. To the German High Command, that was the clearest proof yet that the so-called democratic system was unfit for total war. As one officer flipped the first pages, he let out a short laugh. Lines about decentralized production, civilian oversight, and voluntary workforce participation seemed like the stuff of fantasy. A nation without a singular will, relying on citizens to build its weapons? Madness. There was no iron fist behind the factories, no military overseers, no central dogma, just companies, contracts, and people. The consensus was simple. This was not a threat. It was an industrial sideshow. They had seen the propaganda. Posters of American women smiling while tightening bolts on airplane wings, school teachers becoming welders, housewives operating lathes. The officers exchanged glances, shaking their heads. That wasn't war. That was chaos dressed up as courage. In their eyes, this chaotic democracy would collapse the moment pressure mounted. What they didn't understand, what they refused to see, was that they were not reading a weakness. They were reading a storm gathering across the ocean. The German war machine was built on order, obedience, speed. Factories turned out tanks like clockwork, but those tanks required steel that had to be rationed, engines that had to be imported, and mechanics who had to be drafted from other units. Every part of the machine depended on another. That was its strength. That was also its curse. The United States, by contrast, was still waking up, still improvising, but its strength lay in its chaos, in the messy, loud, inefficient, but unstoppable rhythm of a nation that had more factories than Europe combined, a nation that, in the coming years, would produce more steel than Germany, Italy, and Japan together, a nation that could turn a car assembly line into a tank factory over a single weekend. But none of that was visible yet. In the spring of 1941, what Berlin saw was disarray. American infantry hadn't yet faced the panzers. American aircraft hadn't yet darkened the skies over Europe. All they saw were civilians making tools of war without military supervision. And worse, those civilians were often women. A German general reportedly scoffed in a briefing, "The Americans think they can win a war with secretaries and seamstresses. Let them try." That quote later, uncovered in Allied intelligence, would come to symbolize one of the greatest miscalculations in military history, because while Berlin laughed, Detroit roared to life. Unbeknownst to them, a revolution was taking place on the other side of the Atlantic. Not a political revolution, a logistical one. Assembly lines were being stretched, old factories retooled, entire industries redirected toward one goal: preparation. The sound of industry echoed louder than speeches. Sparks flew from welding, torches, rivets slammed into steel frames. What began as hesitant mobilization was becoming a national heartbeat. The Germans couldn't see that. They were focused on short-term victories, on tactical brilliance, on speed. Their doctrine valued lightning strikes and precision assaults. But lightning burns fast. It doesn't last through the winter. In meetings, American war planners were warning, "This will not be a war of weeks. This will be a war of years, and we will outlast them." But those voices had yet to prove themselves on the battlefield. Until then, all they had was belief, and an army of workers ready to prove that democracy didn't mean disorganization. It meant participation, and that participation would soon flood every battlefield with numbers the Axis could not match. By mid-1941, Germany had 3.5 million troops mobilized across Europe. The U.S. Army had just over 250,000. An officer in Berlin circled that number in red and laughed. "They're building rifles for ghosts," he said. "They don't even have the men, but the rifles would be built. So would the tanks. So would the ships, planes, and bullets. By the billions. The ghost army they mocked would become very real. It just hadn't arrived yet." The real miscalculation wasn't military. It was psychological. The belief that democracy was weak because it was slow, that it lacked unity because it welcomed disagreement, that it couldn't sustain a war because it respected civilian life. These were not flaws. They were the ingredients of something the Nazis could not fathom, a society that fought not because it was commanded, but because it chose to. This truth would not be clear to them until much later, until the skies above Germany were thick with bombers built in factories run by civilians, until the roads of France rumbled with tanks assembled by housewives, until every front line echoed with the sound of American logistics crashing like waves against the carefully laid plans of the Wehrmacht. But in that quiet war room in Berlin, they couldn't hear it yet. They saw a free people and called them disorganized. They saw women with wrenches and called them weak. They saw democracy and mistook it for vulnerability. They didn't realize they were watching the birth of the very thing that would dismantle their empire. If you're feeling the weight of this forgotten moment in history, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this kind of raw historical storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Detroit, 1942. The skyline was still the same. Smokestacks, steel, the humming grid of streets built for cars and workers. But if you listened closely, the sound had changed. The rhythm of the city no longer sang of Chevrolets and Cadillacs. It pulsed with a new urgency. The machines were moving faster, louder, and inside the factories, something unprecedented was happening. The Motor City, once the symbol of American leisure and consumer power, was being stripped to the bone and rebuilt as the most fearsome war engine the world had ever seen. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with purpose. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued a challenge so ambitious it seemed absurd. He demanded the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1 year. Then he raised it to 125,000. To many, it sounded like fantasy, but in Detroit, factories that once built bumpers and radio dials were about to become crucibles of war. One of the first to answer the call was the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford's engineers took on a task so enormous it bordered on madness. They planned to build a bomber factory, not just any factory, but the largest in the world, a plant that could roll out a complete B-24 Liberator every single hour. They called it Willow Run. Built on farmland west of Detroit, Willow Run stretched over 3.5 million square feet. It was so vast that workers reportedly used bicycles to get from one end to the other. At its peak, the factory employed over 42,000 workers, many of them women who had never set foot in an industrial building before the war. The building itself had a design quirk that felt almost poetic, a mile-long assembly line that bent 90 degrees at the end. The reason? Henry Ford didn't want the final product rolling out of the plant into another county, because that would complicate tax filings. And yet, behind every logistical detail was a growing realization. This was not just a factory. It was a declaration, a message to the world that the United States could outproduce any empire, not with threats or brutality, but with coordination, commitment, and sweat. Across the city, General Motors converted its car plants to build tanks, torpedo bombers, and artillery shells. Chrysler switched from making sedans to assembling M4 Sherman tanks. The transition was so complete that by 1943, Detroit was producing one military vehicle every 12 minutes, not designing, not testing, producing fully operational battlefield-ready machines. The scale was staggering. By the end of the war, American factories would produce over 88,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, 12 million rifles, and more than 40 billion bullets. It was not just production. It was an avalanche. But what made this even more extraordinary was the people behind the numbers. These were not soldiers. They were teenagers fresh out of high school, mothers with children, immigrants who had never spoken English before their first shift, black workers who had migrated from the South for a chance at steady work and found themselves welding steel destined for North Africa, Native American machinists, former farmhands, accountants, mechanics, waitresses, students. The war had erased the walls between them. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, rivet guns in hand, building machines that would define a generation. There was no manual for this, no precedent. Training was fast and rough. Mistakes were inevitable, but every hour mattered. Every delay had a cost. And as the war intensified, the tempo of the factories increased. They worked through holidays, through blackouts, through grief. Some women wore pictures of brothers or husbands taped inside their helmets. Others worked double shifts, slept in buses, or lived in boarding houses with 8 to a room. What drove them was not glory. It was the understanding that the faster they worked, the fewer flags would be folded. And it wasn't just Detroit. Across America, the so-called arsenal of democracy began to take shape. Shipyards in California, steel mills in Pennsylvania, aircraft plants in Kansas. The war had awakened the industrial soul of an entire continent, but it was Detroit that led the charge. It was Detroit that taught the world what a free people could accomplish when cornered. By late 1942, German military analysts began to take notice. Reports trickled in of growing American air power, of new tanks arriving in North Africa in staggering numbers, of fresh troops arriving with equipment that looked untouched by combat. Their intelligence officers knew something was changing, but they had no idea just how fast the ground was shifting beneath them. What they missed was this: America was not trying to match Axis strength, it was trying to drown it. Detroit wasn't merely building tanks, it was building momentum, and momentum in war is everything. Each truck, each shell, each uniform pressed and packed by a worker's hand was another drop in a rising tide, a tide that would soon overwhelm the Axis not through brilliance or battlefield genius, but by sheer, relentless, unyielding volume. One of the most overlooked elements of this transformation was the emotional toll it took on the workforce. For every heroic story of sacrifice, there were stories of breakdowns, injuries, loneliness, and loss. The factories were not just filled with sparks and noise, they were filled with pressure to keep up, pressure to never slow down, and above all, the pressure of knowing that failure in Detroit could mean failure in Normandy, in Tunisia, or in the skies over the Pacific. Yet they kept going. It is said that while Nazi Germany perfected the art of destruction, America perfected the art of production. But the truth is deeper. America produced not just machines, it produced belief. In every crate shipped, every fuselage rolled out of a hangar, there was a belief that this mattered, that freedom had to be fought for, not only on the battlefield, but also on the assembly line. Detroit never wore a uniform. It didn't march. It didn't salute, but it fought. Every hour, every shift, every shipment. The enemies of democracy never understood that, and by the time they did, it was too late. If you've made it this far, it means this story spoke to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let your voice join the memory of those who built more than machines. They built the outcome of history. And if stories like this move you, consider subscribing. There's so much more to uncover. She was not a soldier. She didn't carry a rifle or wear a uniform. Yet without her, there would have been no planes in the sky, no tanks rolling across Europe, no ammunition in the rifles of the men fighting overseas. She was known simply as Rosie, but she wasn't one woman. She was millions. Millions of women who walked through factory gates for the first time in their lives and changed the course of history. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the country faced an immediate crisis. Millions of men were drafted, leaving behind a workforce gap that threatened to cripple production. Factories that had just been converted for war suddenly had no one to run them. The newspapers began printing desperate calls for labor. Women wanted for war production. The headlines read, "For the first time, the idea of women taking on industrial labor wasn't just tolerated, it was essential." The first wave arrived cautiously, many wearing their Sunday coats, unsure of what awaited them. They had never handled heavy tools, never stood beside conveyor belts or welding torches. Yet by the end of 1942, women made up nearly 1/3 of the entire American war industry workforce. By 1943, that number reached nearly 6 million. Housewives, teachers, waitresses, and farmers' wives became riveters, machinists, and engine testers. They came from small towns, cities, and reservations. They left behind sewing needles for screwdrivers, aprons for steel gloves, and soft fabrics for cold iron. The name Rosie the Riveter came from a real woman, Rose Will Monroe, a Kentucky-born factory worker who appeared in a promotional film for the war effort. But Rosie was more than a face. She was a spirit, a symbol of defiance wrapped in practicality. The iconic poster of a woman flexing her arm beneath the words, "We can do it," wasn't meant to glorify war. It was meant to keep spirits alive inside the factories, where the air was thick with dust and noise, and the hours were long and brutal. Inside those factories, the work was punishing. The temperature could rise above 90 degrees. The sound of pneumatic rivet guns hammered through the air without pause. Shifts lasted 10, sometimes 12 hours. Fingertips blistered, shoulders burned, and faces were streaked with soot. And yet, production didn't slow down. In one day, Rosie could drill thousands of holes into aluminum sheets that would later form the wings of a bomber. She could fasten hundreds of rivets in a single shift. Some factories ran around the clock, and when one shift ended, another began before the floor had time to cool. In Detroit's Willow Run plant, women worked side by side with men, turning out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In Seattle, Boeing's factories were filled with women assembling flying fortresses. In California, shipyards in Richmond were run by crews of women building Liberty ships in record time. The scale of what they achieved was almost beyond comprehension, but their fight was not just against the enemy abroad, it was also against prejudice at home. Many male supervisors doubted that women could handle the physical strain or the technical precision required. Some mocked them, others refused to train them. Even basic facilities like restrooms or uniforms didn't exist for women in heavy industry. Yet every day, they proved the skeptics wrong. When a male foreman claimed that female workers couldn't lift aircraft parts, women organized into teams and did it anyway. When paychecks came in smaller than their male counterparts for the same work, they worked harder, knowing that every part completed brought a loved one closer to coming home alive. African American women faced an even harder battle. They were often excluded from skilled positions and pushed into the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs. Yet they persisted, welding ships in segregated yards, working in ammunition plants, or driving streetcars in cities that had never seen women of color in uniform. Their determination cracked barriers that would later fuel the civil rights movements that followed the war. The pride that came from that work was something few could describe. Women wrote letters home describing how they could feel the war through the vibrations of the machines. They hung photographs of sons and husbands above their stations, whispering silent prayers as they worked. Some factories had bulletin boards filled with news from the front, and when a soldier's name appeared under missing, the whole floor would go quiet. Then, without a word, they would go back to work. The impact of Rosie and her generation went far beyond production numbers. They changed what society thought possible. Before the war, the idea of a woman working a rivet gun or operating a press was unthinkable. After it, the world would never look the same. When the war ended and many were asked to return home, something had already shifted. They had seen their own capability. They had seen that freedom and equality were not given. They were built, bolt by bolt, on the floor of those factories. Even the enemy began to notice. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence showed German officers expressing disbelief at the scale of American production. One analyst wrote bitterly, "They have turned their women into soldiers of steel." It was meant as an insult. Instead, it became a badge of honor. The strength of democracy wasn't measured in parades or speeches. It was measured in the hands that worked through exhaustion, in the eyes that refused to look away from the flame of a welding torch, in the factories where freedom had a sound, the metallic rhythm of industry pounding against tyranny. What began as necessity became a symbol. Rosie the Riveter was no longer propaganda. She was prophecy, the embodiment of a nation that refused to accept the limits imposed on it or on her. And every plane that lifted from American soil carried her fingerprints, her grit, her quiet defiance. If this story reached you, leave your thoughts in the comments and honor the legacy of those who built victory from sweat and courage. And if you believe history like this deserves to be remembered, subscribe to join us as we bring these forgotten voices back to life. It began not with a weapon, but with a meeting. In early 1942, just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gathered his top advisors and asked a question that would reshape the entire war effort. What if, instead of just fighting battles, America fought with factories? Not one or two, all of them. Every factory, every machine, every worker, every bolt. He envisioned a war strategy not led by generals, but by foremen, engineers, machinists, and production lines that never slept. It was a radical idea, a war won not just with firepower, but with logistics. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, and the term wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a strategic vision, one that treated manufacturing as a front line, and every shipping crate as a silent soldier heading to war. This was not about building weapons to match the enemy. It was about building so many that the enemy would drown in them. Within months, the United States created the War Production Board. Its job was simple in theory, impossible in scope. Take the largest peacetime economy in the world and convert it into a single coordinated war machine. Factories that once made refrigerators were now stamping out bullet casings. Typewriter companies were building machine guns. Piano manufacturers like Steinway were crafting wooden gliders for silent troop deployment. Even lipstick assembly lines were repurposed to fill cartridges. Nothing was off limits, and no one was left out. The result was a mobilization of resources so vast, it redefined what industrial warfare meant. By the end of 1943, over 200,000 companies had converted to war production. Car companies became tank plants, Toy companies built grenades. Coca-Cola followed the troops into battle, setting up bottling plants behind Allied lines to boost morale, a move so impactful that General Eisenhower once remarked he needed as many bottles of Coke as he did bullets. But conversion wasn't just technical, it was psychological. Americans had to believe that their work, their sacrifice, and their routines mattered. And so, the government launched one of the largest public relations campaigns in history. Posters, radio broadcasts, newsreels, even comic books, all reminded citizens that every bolt they turned was part of something larger. The war was not just overseas. It was in the warehouse, in the shipping yard, in the smell of oil on your hands after a 14-hour shift. One of the most powerful examples of this transformation was the Liberty Ship program. German boats were sinking Allied cargo vessels faster than they could be replaced. Traditional shipbuilding methods took up to a year. That was unacceptable. So engineers designed a ship that could be built fast, cheap, and in massive quantities. The result was the Liberty Ship, a simple, sturdy cargo vessel that could be built from prefabricated sections. In 1941, it took around 230 days to build a single Liberty Ship. By 1943, thanks to assembly line techniques, that number dropped to just over 40 days. At the peak of production, the SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. An entire ocean-going vessel, faster than it took to bake a wedding cake in wartime rationing conditions. The Germans watched in disbelief. They could not sink ships faster than America could build them. The same philosophy drove aircraft production. Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress, a complex 4-engine bomber, went from concept to mass deployment in less than 3 years. At the Douglas Aircraft plant in California, bombers rolled off the line every hour. The noise never stopped. Welders, electricians, painters, and inspectors worked shoulder to shoulder, many of them women and teenagers who had never touched machinery before the war. It was not elegant, it was not refined, but it worked. This system didn't run on fear, it ran on rhythm. Every component was part of a greater dance. Logistics teams calculated how to ship parts across the country with pinpoint timing. Freight trains were repurposed as moving warehouses. Highways were redesigned to accommodate convoys of supply trucks. Even mail routes were adjusted to prioritize wartime communication. Nothing was accidental. Every minute lost in a factory could mean lives lost in battle. Every delay on a rail line could shift the tide of a campaign. So, they moved fast, and they moved in sync. But what truly made the American war machine unstoppable was its flexibility. In Germany, factories were centralized, hierarchical, and often too specialized to adapt quickly. In contrast, American manufacturers were given general blueprints, then encouraged to innovate on the floor. If a part could be made faster without losing reliability, it was approved. If a new assembly method saved an hour, it was implemented. Factories shared methods across states. Engineers swapped techniques by telegram. There was no single genius behind the system. The genius was the system itself, and it kept growing. By 1944, American production had reached heights never imagined. Every 5 minutes a new Jeep rolled out. Every 10 minutes a new tank. Every 20 minutes an aircraft. Ammunition was being packed by the ton, loaded onto rail cars and sent to waiting ports. Ships filled with planes, trucks, food, and uniforms stretched in endless lines across the Atlantic. America wasn't just supplying its own troops. It was arming Britain, Russia, China, and every resistance movement that dared to fight back. This scale of production created shockwaves across the enemy ranks. Intercepted communications revealed mounting frustration among Axis commanders who could not understand how one country could output so much, so fast. One German field officer famously wrote, "We destroy 10 tanks, and they send 20 more. It is like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon." It was not magic. It was planning, pressure, sweat, the sound of rivets echoing into the night, the smell of molten metal in the air. It was engineers working. Through holidays, wives driving forklifts while their husbands fought in Europe, grandparents building fuses, children collecting scrap metal and rubber in schoolyard drives. A nation that had once celebrated leisure had now sacrificed it completely. By the war's end, the arsenal of democracy had produced over 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and over 47 billion rounds of ammunition. It had done so not through authoritarian command, but through coordination. Not through fear, but through belief. The belief that democracy, for all its imperfections, could do more than survive. It could adapt, It could accelerate. It could organize at a scale that no dictatorship could match, not because it demanded obedience, but because it inspired participation. If these stories of ingenuity and resilience give you pause, let your thoughts live in the comments and help others discover them. And if you believe the past has lessons still echoing today, consider subscribing and walking with us through the history that shaped our world. At first, it looked like the Germans were right. In 1942, American troops arrived in North Africa wearing mismatched uniforms, driving outdated equipment, and struggling to adapt to desert warfare. Many were young, inexperienced, and clumsy in the eyes of battle-hardened Axis soldiers. Their tanks broke down. Their formations lacked coordination. Their tactics felt textbook. To the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, it seemed like confirmation of everything they had believed about the Americans. This was not a real army. It was a patchwork of optimism and steel, held together by slogans and hope. But Rommel would soon learn a dangerous truth about the enemy he faced. The Americans learned fast, and they never stopped coming. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in early 1943, U.S. forces suffered a humiliating defeat. Their lines broke under German assault. Hundreds were killed, thousands captured. Tanks were left burning in the sand. The defeat shook morale and gave Axis leaders reason to mock the United States once again. But what came next was not retreat. It was adaptation. Within weeks, American commanders reorganized. Logistics were improved. Communication was hardened. Units were retrained. Tactics revised. Eisenhower replaced ineffective officers and sent veterans into advisory roles. New supplies arrived in waves. Shermans replaced worn-out tanks. Fresh aircraft filled the skies. The very next time American and German forces met, the difference was staggering. The Americans were no longer guessing. They were executing. By mid-1943, the Allied advance through North Africa accelerated. In Sicily, then Italy, the same pattern emerged. At first, the Axis put up fierce resistance, but American troops kept moving forward. Every battle lost was followed by a lesson learned. Every equipment failure led to an upgrade. Every casualty reinforced their resolve. Behind them, the eye. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago worked like lungs feeding oxygen to a body in motion. Unlike Germany, where replacement parts were scarce and machinery often irreplaceable, the Americans treated warfare like assembly. Everything had a backup, and every loss was met with reinforcements not next month, but next week. In July 1943, Operation Husky brought nearly 3,000 Allied ships and 160,000 men to the shores of Sicily. It was the largest amphibious assault in history at the time. American troops stormed the beaches supported by wave after wave of tanks, trucks, and aircraft that had been built by people who had never seen a battlefield. The Axis tried to resist, but even their best divisions, seasoned by years of combat, began to falter. They were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting an entire economy. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the transformation was complete. The American military had become a machine of its own. Not perfect, not without losses, but relentless in scale and speed. D-Day alone saw over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 troops land in France. And that was just one operation. For the Germans defending Fortress Europe, the scale was beyond comprehension. They dug into concrete bunkers, confident in the Atlantic Wall, but it wasn't walls they had to fear. It was what came after. Tank after tank, jeep after jeep, soldiers carrying fresh gear, medics with endless supplies, pilots who returned to their bases and found replacement aircraft ready and waiting. The battlefield was no longer tilted in favor of tactical brilliance. It now belonged to the side that could afford to bleed without breaking. There was a saying among American troops: if something broke, call for a new one. If something failed, fix it fast or throw it out. They weren't bound by scarcity. They were empowered by surplus. That surplus wasn't wasteful. It was survival. It meant soldiers could focus on fighting instead of rationing. It meant airfields could keep running without grounding entire squadrons. It meant medics had enough morphine, and gunners had enough rounds to hold their lines. German officers began to write home with growing frustration. They spoke of endless reinforcements, of weapons they had never seen before arriving in quantities that defied logic. One captured general admitted, in interrogation, that the Americans had turned war into a factory line. His tone was not mocking. It was exhausted. The tide of the war had shifted not because the Americans were the best fighters, but because they fought with more food, more fuel, more men, more machines. The longer the war stretched, the more lopsided the fight became. In the skies over Germany, American bombers flew in streams that stretched for miles. When one squadron was hit, another followed. When flak brought down a formation, replacements were already in the air. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, found itself outmatched by sheer weight. German pilots ran out of fuel before they ran out of courage. By 1944, they began to avoid combat entirely. The price of engagement was too high. The front was no longer a line. It was a wave, an industrial wave crashing from one continent to another, crushing any static defense under its momentum. Every city captured became a depot. Every road cleared became a supply route. The American advance wasn't just fast, it was persistent, and nothing could slow it down for long. Soldiers on the ground started to notice. They began to joke that their real commander wasn't Eisenhower. It was a place called Toledo, or Cleveland, or Long Island, because everything they needed came from there. Rations, boots, ammo, even mail. Letters from home arrived quicker than enemy bullets. The war was hell, but behind the front line, America made sure hell had a supply chain. This rhythm, this unstoppable flow, began to do something unexpected. It wore down the will of the enemy, not in a single battle, not in a dramatic collapse, but gradually, painfully, day by day. The Germans had believed they were fighting a weak opponent. Instead, they had awakened something else entirely, something that did not stop. And perhaps the most haunting realization for them was this: for every tank they destroyed, another was already on a ship. For every victory they celebrated, 5 more battles were already being prepared. Their timelines were shrinking, their options narrowing. Their defeat no longer felt like a possibility. It felt like a schedule. If these moments of quiet transformation behind the front lines speak to you, take a second to share your perspective in the comments. And if you want to keep discovering how history was forged, not just by battles, but by persistence, subscribe now and continue this journey with us. They laughed when they first saw the Americans. German officers, hardened by years of war, observed the newcomers with amusement. Their uniforms looked too clean, their formations too loose. Many of them still carried fresh faces, barely out of high school. Their tanks, at first glance, seemed oversized and under-armored, their movements awkward, their equipment unfamiliar. In briefings, they were mocked as factory soldiers, a manufactured army from a nation more known for movies and Coca-Cola than battlefield discipline. To seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front and the deserts of North Africa, this new enemy looked like a poor imitation of a true fighting force. The Wehrmacht had spent years sharpening itself in the crucible of combat. The Americans, in contrast, were seen as soft, too slow, too young, too loud. But then something changed. The laughter began to fade, not because the Americans suddenly became flawless, but because they refused to disappear. Every time a German unit smashed through a line, the line reformed. Every time a supply column was ambushed, another arrived the next day. Their tanks kept coming. Their planes returned in greater numbers. Their resolve, once dismissed as naive, began to take on a new shape, one that was heavier, more enduring, more dangerous. There is a particular kind of fear that only comes when a joke stops being funny. At first, German troops nicknamed American Shermans as Ronsons because they lit up easily when hit. They joked that the Yanks were only dangerous in Hollywood, but the jokes got quieter as the months passed. American troops learned. Their tactics evolved. Their technology adapted. Their tanks may have been vulnerable, but they traveled with artillery support, air cover, and unshakable logistics. The Shermans came in waves. When one was destroyed, 3 more replaced it. They stopped being underestimated the moment the war stopped being theoretical, the moment their artillery flattened German bunkers, the moment their P-47s screamed down from the sky like thunder made metal, the moment German lines, once solid as concrete, began to bend under pressure that never relented. By the winter of 1944, what had once been laughed at was now feared, and not just for its strength, but for its rhythm. The Americans didn't fight like the Germans. They didn't rely on single decisive battles. They didn't wait for the perfect moment. They moved with a different tempo. If something didn't work, they changed it. If a plan failed, they tried another. They were not elegant, but they were relentless, and that made them lethal. German soldiers began to notice that the enemy never seemed to run out, not of bullets, not of tanks, not of men. They called it the Flood, a quiet nickname spoken in trenches and bunkers as convoys rolled through the night. The Flood meant the next wave was coming, and the next, and the next. Psychologically, this was devastating. In the German military culture, war had always been a matter of precision, timing, and command. But how do you fight an enemy that never stops? An enemy who absorbs losses and grows stronger, an enemy who seems to have factories growing from the ground. Captured German diaries began to reflect this shift. In one entry, a panzer officer wrote, "We killed 100 of them today, but tomorrow there will be 200 more." Another, stationed near the Hurtgen forest, described watching American columns pass for hours without end. He wrote, "It is not a battle, it is drowning." Even the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, began to crumble under this pressure. German pilots, already short on fuel and replacements, faced bomber formations protected by P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. For every one German fighter in the air, there were 6 or 7 American ones, and the American bombers just kept coming. They flew in staggered waves, destroying refineries, factories, rail lines. They did not just strike military targets, they strangled the entire German war effort from above, and from below, the fear continued to grow. Because the enemy the Germans had mocked was no longer an underdog, he was an avalanche. There's something deeply unsettling about fighting a force you cannot exhaust. Morale begins to crack, plans begin to unravel. You no longer think about winning, you begin thinking about how long you can hold, and slowly you stop thinking about victory at all. Some of the Wehrmacht's most elite divisions were eventually pulled back, not because they were defeated in traditional terms, but because they were worn down by attrition. They had no rest, no relief, no replacement parts, while the Americans rotated fresh troops in and out, fed their men hot meals, and fixed broken equipment overnight. The Germans tightened belts and shared ammunition. Their machines became ghosts of their former selves, their veterans, shadows. What began as arrogance turned into silence, then silence into dread, then dread into collapse. Even propaganda began to change. German broadcasts stopped mocking American forces and started focusing on how to resist them. The tone shifted from bravado to warning. They called them the Iron Swarm. They spoke of endless engines, of the death factories in America that never turned off. The myth of American weakness had died, and in its place stood something far more intimidating, the realization that freedom, when organized, becomes something you cannot stop. Perhaps the most bitter truth for German command was not the enemy's strength, it was their own miscalculation. They had laughed, and that laughter had cost them everything. If this emotional shift in the battlefield struck something in you, I invite you to share your reflections in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive, and if you believe that forgotten lessons from the past deserve to be remembered with clarity and care, consider subscribing and walking this road of history with us. There was no battlefield here, no craters in the ground, no enemy fire, no barbed wire or blood-soaked soil, but still there was war. It echoed through the thunder of stamping presses, the hiss of molten steel, and the rhythmic rattle of conveyor belts stretching for miles. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and sweat, thick with dust, and the quiet pressure of urgency. On the floor of the American war factories, every bolt tightened and every engine assembled carried the weight of lives far away. The battlefield might have been overseas, but the fight started here. Inside these enormous industrial cathedrals, there was no silence. The machines roared without pause. Sparks flew like shrapnel from welders' torches. Workers shouted over the clamor, their voices hoarse from hours spent in a place where the sound never stopped. They were not soldiers, but their work saved soldiers' lives. At Ford's Willow Run plant, a B-24 bomber came off the line every 63 minutes. The plant ran around the clock, 7 days a week. Thousands of workers operated in carefully timed shifts, each person trained to perform a task with precision and speed. No one built a plane alone. Each bomber was the sum of over 1 million parts and hundreds of hands. No hand was more important than the other. Many of those hands belonged to women who had never touched a machine before 1942. They learned fast. A 16-year-old girl from Ohio might have spent her youth knitting or cleaning, but now she riveted the fuselage of a bomber that would fly over Berlin. A grandmother who had once worked in a bakery now inspected engine casings with eyes sharpened by repetition. They didn't wear uniforms, but they wore bandanas to keep the sweat from their eyes, and gloves to keep the cuts off their skin. In shipyards along the West Coast, workers stood on scaffolding for hours at a time, welding Liberty ships from steel plates so massive that the heat warped the very ground beneath them. At peak output, they launched a ship every 4 days. Some workers slept on site between shifts, curled up in corners or resting on benches, too tired to go home, too driven to stop. Conditions were harsh. In many plants, there was no air conditioning. In the summer, temperatures soared past 100 degrees. In the winter, frost crept in through poorly insulated walls. There were injuries, Cuts, burns, even fatalities. But few complained. Most knew someone overseas. A brother, a son, a husband. Some taped photographs to their workstations. Others carved initials into machine parts. Silent messages carried across oceans. It was not a job. It was a duty. Supervisors walked the floor with clipboards and timers, measuring efficiency down to the second. Assembly errors were costly. If a bolt was fastened too loosely, or a weld line missed, it could mean disaster at 20,000 feet. There was no margin for error. Quality control became a sacred ritual. Veterans who had returned from the front lines often joined the factories. Some were wounded, unable to return to combat. They brought with them the sound of war. Their stories reminded every worker why their hands mattered. A misplaced part, they said, could mean a lost crew. An unreliable engine could turn into a death sentence. The message was clear. If you got it right in here, they had a better chance out there. And so, they got it right, again and again. Children too young to work helped in scrap drives, collecting metal, rubber, paper. Schools turned playgrounds into collection zones. Radios broadcast hourly updates on war bond drives. In some neighborhoods, friendly rivalries broke out over which block could raise the most or send the most letters to soldiers abroad. The entire society breathed war, not in a panicked way, but with steady, determined lungs. The human side of this machinery was everywhere. Couples met on factory floors. Some even married between shifts. Others suffered in silence. Mothers lost sons and came back to work the next morning. Friends watched friends fall asleep standing up, only to be jolted awake by the next drill or spark. Laughter still found its place in break rooms and shared lunches, but behind every joke was exhaustion. For Black Americans and other minorities, the factories were a double-edged sword. On one hand, the war opened doors. For the first time, some employers hired workers regardless of race. On the other, discrimination remained. Black workers were often paid less and kept in the least desirable jobs. Yet they came, proud, ready, resilient. They joined a war effort that had not fully accepted them because they knew freedom was still worth fighting for. Every person in those plants carried their own war, a war of fatigue, of repetition, of sacrifice, and they carried it with a quiet heroism that rarely made the newspapers. And yet their fingerprints are on every piece of victory, on every Sherman tank that crossed the Rhine, on every P-51 that flew escort, on every bullet loaded, every parachute folded, every bridge assembled from pre-packed steel. They were there, invisible and essential. And when the war ended, many were told to go home, return to normal. But something had changed. They had seen what they were capable of. They had seen what unity could do. They had stared into the furnace of necessity and built something unshakable. Victory did not come from the front lines alone. It was forged in places where no shots were fired, places filled with noise, sweat, steel, and the stubborn refusal to stop. If this part of the story moved you, take a moment to honor the invisible hands that shaped our world. Share your reflections in the comments, and if you feel this history should never fade, subscribe and be part of keeping it alive with us. They called it weakness. When German intelligence analysts looked at the American war structure, they saw disorganization, multiple military branches working under different commands, factories privately owned and scattered across states, a population that debated everything, from foreign policy to rationing guidelines. In their eyes, this wasn't a war machine. It was a nation of committees and contradictions. The idea that such a system could overpower the industrial discipline of the Reich seemed laughable, but they misunderstood something fundamental. The American system didn't collapse under pressure. It multiplied. The chaos wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. While authoritarian regimes demanded order and obedience, democracies absorbed shock. Where others cracked, the United States flexed. Like a tree bending in the wind, its strength came not from rigidity but from its capacity to adjust without breaking. This was the illusion that began to shatter as 1944 turned into 1945. The war had entered its final stage, and the cracks in the Axis war effort were no longer subtle. German factories had been bombed into silence. Oil supplies ran dry. Rail lines were cut. Communications faltered. And as the Wehrmacht tried to regroup, they were hit by a realization far more terrifying than a shelling. Their enemy had no intention of stopping. The same enemy they once called soft was now everywhere. In the fields of France, GIs moved in columns of tanks that seemed endless. On the roads of Belgium, convoys stretched past the horizon. In the skies above the Rhine, the sun was often obscured by waves of bombers. And behind it all, across an ocean, a nation of supposed weaklings was producing at levels the Axis had never imagined possible. American democracy had not only survived total war, it had industrialized it. Factories did not wait for central instructions, they improvised. If raw materials were delayed, substitutions were made. If a production line jammed, another plant stepped in. While the German system stalled with every setback, the American system routed around problems like water flowing around rock. It found cracks, it created new paths, and it moved forward without needing to be told how. At the core of this adaptability was trust. Workers trusted that their efforts mattered. Managers trusted that their teams could make decisions without bureaucratic delays. Military commanders trusted that supplies would arrive, even if plans changed. That trust was not imposed. It was earned through shared sacrifice. Even small towns played a role. A machinist in Indiana might not know the soldier using the gear he forged, but he knew that gear mattered. A group of high school students in Oregon might not know what their paper drive would fund, but they knew it would help. There was no centralized script. Everyone was writing their own page, and somehow together, it became a novel of momentum. The power of this decentralized structure wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. The Axis, built on domination and fear, had no backup plan when things went wrong. When Allied bombing destroyed a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt, German production across the continent suffered. When the Americans lost a plant, others filled the gap in days. There's a reason German officers described American power as diffuse, not because it was scattered, but because it could not be struck in a single place. It was everywhere and nowhere. Its strength didn't rely on a central hub. It lived in the hands of millions. The phrase, "the sleeping giant," is often used to describe America's wartime awakening, but in truth it wasn't a giant. It was a swarm, a network, a living, breathing ecosystem of effort that moved too fast to be cornered and too broad to be silenced. And at the center of this swarm was something no dictator could replicate: belief. Not belief in conquest, or racial supremacy, or destiny, but belief in one another. The belief that a free society, with all its mess and argument and diversity, could still outproduce, outfight, and outlast a regime built on fear. This was the greatest strategic miscalculation of the war. That liberty made people soft. That consensus made them slow. That debate made them divided. But every Liberty ship launched proved otherwise. Every rifle built in a Chicago basement, every engine crated in Detroit, every bridge assembled from American steel, all of it came from a place the Axis could never reach: voluntary unity. And in the final months of the war, this truth became impossible to ignore. German soldiers surrendered not just to men with guns, but to men with radios calling for more trucks, more food, more medical tents. Officers surrendered not just to generals, but to an empire of logistics that could supply a battlefield the size of Europe without blinking. The Reich had run out of fuel, out of steel, out of replacements, out of time. But the Americans? They were just beginning to show what their system was truly capable of. The illusion of weakness had not only been broken, it had been melted down and reforged into the very tools of victory. If this reversal of expectation and power struck a chord with you, add your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that history gains strength when it is retold with honesty and depth, subscribe and help preserve the stories that shaped the world we live in. It did not end with an explosion. It ended with footsteps, boots marching through silent streets, tank tracks scraping across shattered cobblestone, the metallic groan of bridges bearing the weight of victory, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a generator still running, a whisper of the machine that had never stopped. May 1945. The guns fell quiet. Smoke drifted slowly over the ruins of what had once been a 1,000-year empire. Cities like Dresden and Cologne lay in skeletal silence. Rail yards twisted like broken ribs. The Reichstag stood wounded, its flag replaced. And where German officers had once spoken with cold certainty about the future, now there was only the sound of surrender. But it wasn't just armies that entered Germany. It was the echo of a nation they once ridiculed. The tanks that rolled down Berlin's avenues had been built by mothers in Michigan. The boots on the ground had come from Kansas City. The trucks carrying supplies were assembled by immigrants in Buffalo, welders in New Jersey, farm boys in Texas. The victory that unfolded across Europe was not delivered by generals alone. It was carried piece by the millions who had believed in something bigger than themselves. Years earlier, those same officers had dismissed American democracy as soft. They called it disorganized, undisciplined, unfocused. They laughed at the idea of civilians building war machines. They mocked the notion of women running factories. They saw liberty not as strength, but as fragility. And now, their war rooms were silent. Their maps were meaningless. Their pride had collapsed under a truth they had refused to see. Because in the end, the true engine of victory was not a tank or a bomber or a battleship. It was a system, a belief, an idea. That freedom, when protected and pushed to its limit, could become a force no empire could contain. The women who had built the planes didn't see where they landed. The men who riveted tanks didn't know what road they would take, but they believed it mattered. And that belief spread like steel across the ocean, until it landed on enemy soil, wrapped in thunder and finality. This was not just an American victory, it was a human one. It proved that open societies, for all their flaws and noise, could still outlast and outbuild regimes built on fear. It proved that complexity could beat cruelty, that factories could fight, that liberty, though slow to rise, strikes harder when awakened, and perhaps the most powerful proof of all, the respect of those who once mocked it. In post-war interviews, some captured German officers admitted what they had come to understand too late. They had not been fighting soldiers alone. They had been fighting an economy, a culture, a people, and a principle that cannot be bombed, cannot be broken, cannot be silenced, because it lives in minds, in voices, in hands that build, not because they are told to, but because they choose to. This is what frightened them most in the final days. Not the thunder of the artillery, but the quiet certainty of what was coming next. The realization that this force, born of freedom, would not stop at the end of the war. It would rebuild, it would reshape, it would remain. And so, the laughter ended, the flags came down, the machines turned off. But the story did not. It continues in the memories of those who lived it, in the freedoms protected since, in the lessons left behind. And now, it continues with you. Thank you for walking with us through this story, through the factories and front lines, the chaos and courage, the loss and the legacy. If this journey left an impression, share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of the memory. And if you believe stories like this deserve to live on, not in silence, but in clarity, please subscribe and help carry this flame forward. There's always more to discover, more to remember, and just ahead, the next untold story is waiting. Click the next video on your screen to keep exploring the history that built the world you live in. And never forget, sometimes the loudest sound of victory is the silence that follows.